Paris, spring of the 14th century. Streets are silent. Not a child cries, not a bell rings, and yet the buildings still stand. Inside, families lie dead, twisted and rotting, while the walls around them remain untouched, almost alive. One name appears again and again in parish records, a mysterious architect who drew water from mass graves and mixed it into his mortar. His houses outlast the plague, outlast the people, and somewhere inside, they hold every death they were fed. Would you dare step inside one of these walls, knowing what built them? The first sign was not the bodies, but the silence. In the spring of the 14th century, when Paris still stank of tanners, pits, rotting fish, and heavy incense burned to ward off divine anger, entire streets fell mute overnight. The city had always been loud, even in sleep. Cart wheels groaned, drunkards shouted, bells rang without mercy. Now there was nothing. No coughing, no prayers, no crying children. Sound itself seemed to recoil from the stone, abandoning it as something already claimed. Behind shuttered windows, families lay where sickness had dropped them, bodies twisted into shapes that spoke of sudden weakness rather than struggle. Mouths hung open, lips darkened, fingers clawed at air that had failed them. The smell came first, thick and sweet, a breath that slid under doors and clung to clothing. Yet amid this decay, something felt wrong in a way that unsettled even seasoned gravediggers. The houses themselves stood untouched. Their roofs did not sag. Their beams did not groan. Rain slid cleanly from their walls, leaving no stains, as if the buildings refused to absorb the corruption festering inside. At dawn, crows gathered along the ridgelines of rooftops, their black forms sharp against the pale sky. They waited. They hopped closer to chimneys and gables, tilting their heads in confusion. There was no movement below, no doors opening, no hands tossing refuse into the streets. The birds called once or twice, then fell silent themselves, as though instinct warned them away. The city, stripped of human sound, felt hollow, like a skull emptied of thought. As days passed, the pattern began to whisper its presence. Not all streets died the same way. Entire neighborhoods collapsed into rot and panic, yet clusters of buildings remained eerily unchanged, standing shoulder to shoulder while everything around them withered. Inside them, death was absolute, but outside, the stone remained clean, stubbornly preserved. Lime-washed walls showed no cracking. Wooden doors resisted warping. Even the iron fittings remained free of rust, despite the damp air and constant funerals passing below. Those tasked with removing the dead noticed it first. They dragged bodies from these houses and felt a strange reluctance in the walls, as if the stone tightened when the corpses were pulled away. The air inside felt heavier, pressing against the chest, carrying a low, almost imperceptible vibration. Some claimed it matched the rhythm of breathing, slow and patient, though no living lungs remained within. Paris had endured famine, fire, and flood, but this was different. The plague devoured people, yet spared certain structures with deliberate consistency. These buildings did not feel abandoned. They felt occupied, and as the silence deepened, spreading like a stain across the city, an unspoken fear took root. The sickness was not merely killing. It was selecting. The pattern revealed itself slowly, like mold creeping across bread left too long in a damp cellar. At first it appeared accidental, dismissed as coincidence by men desperate for logic, but repetition has a way of sharpening fear. The same houses endured while others collapsed into rot and abandonment. They rose intact from streets where doors hung loose and roofs caved inward, standing in clusters that looked almost intentional, like islands of stubborn stone surrounded by human absence. Even as entire neighborhoods were swallowed by sickness, these structures resisted decay with a quiet defiance that unsettled anyone who lingered too long in their shadow. They shared proportions that felt subtly wrong. The walls leaned inward just enough to create unease without betraying structural fault. Stairwells narrowed as they climbed, squeezing the breath from those ascending them, forcing shoulders close to stone that felt faintly warm to the touch. Doorways pressed inward, not crooked but deliberate, shaping the body's passage as if measuring it. Windows sat too high or too low, denying the eye a natural line of sight. People passing by felt watched without seeing anything that watched them. The geometry offended instinct rather than reason, and that offense lingered long after the buildings were left behind. Clerks and parish scribes, desperate to impose order on the mounting death toll, began marking addresses alongside names of the deceased. Over time, the ink traced an unmistakable shape. The same addresses repeated. The same houses absorbed entire families, servants, tenants, and visitors alike, yet the buildings themselves never fell into neglect. Repairs were unnecessary. Roof tiles remained fixed. Mortar lines held fast. The city could not ignore it forever. What resisted plague did so not by sheltering life, but by enduring its removal. From the records emerged a name, written first in passing, then circled, then underlined with a trembling hand. An architect whose commissions clustered tightly around those surviving houses. His work predated the outbreak by only a few years, a narrow window that made the connection impossible to dismiss. He did not belong to the guilds in the usual way. His permits were irregular, his fees unusually low, his speed unnerving. He worked alone, refusing apprentices, declining supervision, and rejecting revisions. Clients described him as efficient, silent, and attentive in a way that felt less like service and more like assessment. He arrived before dawn, when the streets were still damp with night and the air tasted of ash. Neighbors recalled seeing his silhouette against unfinished walls long before the bells rang for morning prayers. He left only after sunset, disappearing with the light, his figure already half claimed by shadow. His boots were always darkened, not by mud or pitch, but by a pale residue that clung stubbornly to leather. Those who brushed against him noticed a faint chalky dust falling away, leaving a cold trace on skin that lingered longer than expected. Suppliers began to whisper among themselves. He purchased lime in quantities that exceeded the needs of his projects. He requested water deliveries at strange hours and from unusual sources, sometimes rejecting clean well water in favor of barrels drawn from the outskirts of the city. The water he used carried a faint discoloration, cloudy and heavy, leaving sediment behind when left undisturbed. When questioned, he offered no explanation, only a steady look that made men forget why they had asked. The mortar he mixed behaved unlike any other. It set slowly, resisting cracks even when struck too soon. It retained warmth long after it should have cooled, a deep internal heat that radiated faintly through stone. Masons who assisted briefly before being dismissed complained of headaches, nosebleeds, and an oppressive sensation behind the eyes. They said the walls seemed to hum when the city grew quiet. A vibration felt more than heard, like a distant chant swallowed by stone. Inside these houses, the air felt compressed. Sound traveled oddly, footsteps dull and absorbed, voices flattened and returned without echo. Even before the plague, residents complained of restless sleep and vivid dreams marked by narrow spaces and pressing walls. After the sickness arrived, these sensations intensified. Survivors described waking with the sense of being counted, measured, weighed by the structure itself. Their breath fogged the air even in summer. Their pulse seemed to slow once they crossed the threshold, syncing with something older and steadier than their own bodies. As fear grew, so did speculation. Some claimed the architect possessed forbidden knowledge, drawn from texts smuggled out of monastic libraries or whispered by foreign scholars. Others insisted he was no man at all, but an agent of punishment sent to reshape the city into a monument of warning. The church muttered of blasphemy, but offered no condemnation, wary of drawing attention to buildings that still stood while sanctuaries emptied. Attempts to locate the architect failed. His workshop, when finally entered, revealed tools arranged with unsettling precision. Each hammer, chisel, and square rested in perfect alignment, scrubbed clean yet faintly stained beneath the surface. The floor bore etched diagrams worn smooth by repeated kneeling, shapes that blended geometry with something closer to ritual. There were no plans, no contracts, no correspondence. Only a single ledger, its pages filled not with measurements, but with lists of addresses crossed out one by one. As the plague advanced, the houses continued to stand, unchanged, watching the city empty itself around them. The pattern was no longer subtle. It pressed itself into the minds of Paris like a bruise, darkening with every passing day. These buildings had not resisted death. They had welcomed it. And somewhere within their walls, something patient waited, strengthened by every life removed, its foundation set not in earth, but in the accumulated weight of endings. As the Black Death tightened its grip, rumors fermented faster than the disease itself, swelling in the dark spaces where certainty had collapsed. Fear needed somewhere to go, and it poured into whispers that moved through Paris like smoke. Gravediggers spoke first, their voices roughened by lime dust and sleepless nights. They claimed the architect walked beyond the city walls after sunset, where the ground had been torn open into long communal pits. There, amid swollen corpses stacked like broken timber, he was said to draw water not from wells or streams, but from shallow pools that collected where bodies burst and sank. The liquid clung thickly to his buckets, carrying a sheen that caught moonlight in a way no clean water ever had. Those who watched from a distance said he worked methodically, never hurried, never flinching at the stench or the soft sounds rising from the pits as gases escaped the dead. He lowered his bucket slowly, as if careful not to disturb something sleeping beneath the surface. When he left, his hands were always clean, but the water sloshing behind him left faint trails that steamed briefly against the cold earth. By morning, nothing remained but footprints pressed deep into the soil, as though the ground itself had softened to receive him. Masons added their own testimony, reluctant but shaken. They claimed the mortar used in his buildings never truly dried. It hardened, yes, but retained a subtle pliancy beneath the surface, resisting fracture in ways that defied experience. Walls remained faintly warm even after weeks of exposure, a deep internal heat that did not fade with time or weather. Some swore they felt a pulse when they leaned too close, a steady pressure that throbbed against their cheekbones and temples. Others refused to return to sites where they had briefly assisted, citing nausea, trembling hands, and dreams filled with narrowing corridors and sealed mouths. Those foolish or desperate enough to touch the walls noticed something worse. Beneath the cold stone lay a softness, barely perceptible, as if the surface concealed a layer that yielded under pressure before returning to stillness. It felt wrong in the way flesh feels wrong when encountered where it should not exist. Fingers recoiled instinctively, hearts racing, the sensation lingering long after contact ended. Some described it as the feeling of pressing against a pulse through thick cloth. Others could only say the walls felt aware. Inside these houses, the effect intensified. Survivors who remained long enough to be questioned described an unsteady sensation that never fully abated. The air felt dense, pressing inward, causing ears to ache as though descending underground. Sound behaved strangely, absorbed rather than reflected, leaving rooms eerily quiet even when filled with movement. Beneath it all ran a low rhythmic presence, not heard but sensed, a slow cadence that mimicked breathing. It rose and fell with deliberate patience, unconcerned with the panic of those trapped within its reach. At night, this rhythm grew more pronounced. Candles flickered without drafts. Shadows shifted against walls in patterns that did not match the flame. Some claimed the buildings sighed, long exhalations that carried the damp scent of lime and iron. Others reported waking to the sensation of being pressed gently into their beds, as though the house itself sought to hold them still. Sleep came heavy and dreamless, or not at all. Those who did sleep dreamed of stone closing over their faces, of being folded inward, of warmth that smothered rather than comforted. The church attempted to quell the growing hysteria, but even priests hesitated to enter the affected houses. Holy water dried too quickly on the walls. Incense smoke clung unnaturally low, refusing to rise. Blessings spoken aloud seemed to vanish into the stone, swallowed without echo. Some clerics noted hairline cracks forming in sacred symbols carved above doorways, lines that resembled veins more than fractures. No official condemnation was issued. Silence, once again, proved safer than truth. Beyond the city, the burial grounds expanded relentlessly. Carts creaked beneath their loads, wheels sinking into soil made slick with decay. The pits multiplied, shallow at first, then deeper as space vanished. Lime was scattered by the barrel, turning flesh pale and brittle, but the smell never left. It clung to clothes, to hair, to breath itself. It was here, among the dead stacked in nameless layers, that sightings of the architect increased. He moved with the certainty of one who belonged, navigating the pits without stumbling, as though memorizing their contents. Some claimed he knelt at the edges, tracing shapes into the mud with deliberate care. Others said he pressed his palms flat against the earth and waited, unmoving, for hours at a time. The idea spread that he listened to the dead, that he learned from them. That the buildings rising within the city were not merely constructed, but instructed, shaped by something drawn up from beneath the graves. Fear sharpened into accusation. The architect became a vessel for every unanswered question, every death that defied explanation. Yet no one could point to a single surviving resident saved by his work. The houses endured, not the people. Entire households vanished within walls that remained pristine, as if the structures themselves had consumed what was placed inside them. This inversion unsettled the city more than the plague ever had. Death was expected. Indifference was not. As weeks bled into months, the rhythm felt within those buildings began to echo beyond their walls. Passers-by reported a subtle pressure in the chest when walking too close, a brief shortness of breath that eased only after distance was put between them and the stone. Children cried without knowing why. Animals avoided the streets altogether. Even the bells rang differently, their tones flattened, as though the air itself resisted vibration. By the time entire districts lay emptied, the rumors no longer sounded like madness. They sounded like fragments of a larger truth pressing upward through fear. The architect was no longer simply a man. He was a function, a conduit. Something had passed through him, something that learned how cities were built and how bodies failed. And as Paris rotted around those stubborn houses, one certainty settled like dust across the survivors' minds. Whatever lived within those walls was growing stronger. It was learning the shape of the city by heart. When officials finally entered one of the plague houses, they expected the familiar signs of collapse. They carried cloths soaked in vinegar, charms pressed into their palms, and the hard resignation of men who had already seen too much rot to be surprised by it. What they found instead unsettled them more deeply than any pile of corpses. There were no rats, no nests, no gnawed beams, no swarms of flies erupting from hidden corners. The rooms were clean in a way that felt deliberate, preserved rather than abandoned, as if decay itself had been turned away at the threshold. The smell struck them first, thick and clinging, embedded in the walls rather than the air. It was not the sharp reek of sickness nor the sourness of waste. It was heavier, layered, a blend of lime and iron threaded through with something sweetly putrid, like blood left too long beneath the sun until it began to ferment. The scent intensified near the corners of rooms and along load-bearing walls, places where stone met stone and weight pressed downward. No amount of ventilation disturbed it. The smell did not move. It waited. They tore up floorboards and pried away plaster, expecting to uncover hidden refuse or sealed chambers of decay. Instead, they found dense, flawless masonry beneath, smooth and unbroken. The mortar resisted their tools, dulling blades and splintering wedges. When fragments finally chipped free, they crumbled into fine pale dust that stained gloves and refused to wash away. Some officials complained of dizziness, others of pressure behind the eyes. One retched without explanation and could not be persuaded to re-enter. At night, the houses revealed what daylight concealed. Watchmen patrolling the emptied streets reported sounds drifting from the structures after sunset. Not the cracking of wood or the settling groans of old buildings, but long, measured exhalations that fogged the air in winter. The breath rose from shutters and door seams, carrying that same iron-sweet scent, dissipating slowly as though reluctant to leave. Lantern light bent strangely near the walls, shadows thickening and thinning without obvious cause. Those who lingered too long felt their own breathing slow, drawn into a rhythm not entirely their own. Complaints spread among nearby residents who still dared remain. Sleep became difficult. The buildings seemed louder at night, their presence heavier. Some swore the walls shifted inward by imperceptible degrees, narrowing rooms that had not been altered. Others described the sensation of being listened to, of having thoughts pressed flat against stone and absorbed. No evidence could be gathered, no measurements recorded that proved change, yet the certainty remained. These houses were not empty. They were attentive. With growing urgency, officials sought the architect himself. Orders were issued, inquiries sent through guilds and parishes, rewards promised for information. Nothing surfaced. His name appeared only in old contracts and faded records, never accompanied by an address that still existed. The places where he had lodged had collapsed or been repurposed. No family came forward. No apprentice claimed him. It was as though he had never belonged to the city at all, only passed through it, leaving structures behind like molted skins. His workshop was discovered by chance, tucked behind a row of abandoned tannery sheds near the river. The door hung unlocked, opening without resistance, as if waiting. Inside, the space felt compressed, lower than its dimensions suggested. Tools lined the walls in perfect alignment, each scrubbed clean yet stained faintly beneath the surface, discolorations that resembled shadows rather than grime. No dust lay upon them, despite the workshop's abandonment. The air was cool and still, carrying that same underlying scent, weaker here but unmistakable. The floor bore the most troubling evidence. Etched into the stone were geometric diagrams worn smooth by repeated kneeling. Circles intersected with angles that refused simple interpretation, proportions that echoed the strange dimensions of the surviving houses. The markings radiated outward from a central point darkened by countless hours of contact. Kneeling there, officials felt a faint vibration through their bones, a deep hum that settled behind the ribs. Some claimed the patterns resembled architectural plans. Others insisted they mirrored burial layouts beyond the walls. No consensus formed, only unease. There were no written plans, no correspondence, no accounts. One ledger lay open on a narrow table, its pages filled not with measurements, but with addresses. Each had been carefully crossed out in thick strokes. The last entries corresponded precisely to the houses that still stood. No new addresses followed. The list ended abruptly, as if the work it recorded had reached completion. As word of the inspection spread, fear shifted into something colder. The city had tolerated the plague as punishment, as chance, as fate. This was different. The evidence suggested intention. These houses had been prepared. They had been fed. Whatever filled their walls had been measured carefully, harvested patiently from the dead and bound into stone with obsessive precision. The architect had not fled the plague. He had anticipated it. Night after night, the buildings continued to exhale. In the cold months, frost formed briefly around their edges before melting away, leaving damp outlines that resembled fingerprints. Snow refused to settle evenly on their roofs, sliding off in sudden sheets, as though shed by warmth from within. People crossed streets to avoid passing too close, heads lowered, breath held until distance returned safety. The search for the architect widened beyond Paris, but nothing followed. No sightings, no records. It became easier to imagine that he had dissolved into his work, absorbed by the structures he created. The idea spread quietly, not as rumor, but as resignation. Some things did not leave. They stayed, embedded, waiting. By the end of that winter, the officials sealed the inspected house, marking it unfit for habitation. The decree meant nothing. No one would have entered willingly. The building stood dark and silent, yet never felt dormant. Even empty, it pressed against the city, a reminder that the plague had done more than kill. It had been given shape, and somewhere within those walls, something endured, patient and intact, long after the people who fed it had turned to dust. The truth emerged only after the plague had already hollowed Paris, after fear had dulled into exhaustion, and survival itself felt like a kind of betrayal. It came not through confession or discovery, but through collapse. One of the enduring houses, long sealed and avoided, finally gave way along a narrow alley where rainwater pooled and winter frost gnawed at stone. The wall did not crack outward as masonry should. It folded inward, sinking with a soft, heavy sound, like a body settling into mud. What spilled from the wound was not rubble alone. Beneath the outer stone lay layers of pale gray matter, compacted and smooth, too uniform to be soil. When disturbed, it rose in faint clouds that clung to clothing and skin. Those present tasted bitterness and iron at the back of the throat. It was ash, human ash, ground finer than flour, and bound so completely into the mortar that it had become inseparable from the structure itself. Mixed through it were fragments of bone reduced to powder, their original shapes erased through relentless grinding and pressure. The revelation spread quickly, carried on shaking hands and retching breaths. Samples taken from the wall confirmed what instinct already knew. This was no accidental contamination. The quantities were immense, far beyond what could be introduced unknowingly. Each stone had been set with care, each layer fed deliberately. The buildings had not merely touched death, they had been built from it. As more sections were dismantled under official order, the pattern deepened. The inner walls held denser concentrations than the outer faces, as though the structures had been designed to pull inward, to draw something toward their cores. Floors revealed similar composition, their strength owed not to craftsmanship alone, but to saturation. Death had been used as reinforcement, reduced and repurposed into a binding agent stronger than lime alone could ever be. It became clear then that the architect had not relied solely on tainted water or proximity to burial pits. He had harvested the dead. Bodies burned beyond recognition, bones crushed until they surrendered their last resistance, all reduced to material. Each house represented hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives processed and absorbed. The city had buried its dead in haste, believing them lost to earth. Instead, they had been reclaimed and folded back into the city's skeleton. The implications sickened even those hardened by months of suffering. The plague had not been resisted by these buildings. It had been consumed. The sickness, drawn into spaces saturated with death, concentrated rather than dispersed. The houses acted like lungs filled with ash, pulling contagion inward and trapping it within walls designed to hold what flesh could not. Those who lived inside them were never meant to survive. They were offerings, necessary to complete the cycle. Records were revisited with new eyes. Entire households had perished more quickly within these structures than elsewhere. Death moved faster there, more decisively, leaving fewer survivors to tell of it. The houses did not shelter life. They accelerated its removal. They drank the plague deeply, until nothing remained within but silence and stone. This explained the absence of rot, explains the lack of vermin, explains the warmth that lingered in walls long after construction ended. The mortar was alive in a sense, saturated with what had once lived, carrying a latent energy that defied decay. Fire struggled to damage it. Weather failed to weaken it. The houses endured because they were already dead. The city reeled under the weight of this understanding. The architect had not been mad. He had been precise. His designs, his strange proportions, his narrowing stairwells and pressing doorways, all served a purpose beyond aesthetics. They shaped the movement of air, of bodies, of sickness itself. The geometry guided death inward, funneling it toward dense cores where it could be absorbed, bound, and stored. The plague, once seen as a wave that swept indiscriminately through Paris, now appeared guided, shaped by stone and intention. Entire streets had been sacrificed to preserve these vessels. The city had unknowingly participated, delivering its dead to be transformed into permanence. Attempts were made to destroy the remaining houses. Fire blackened their exteriors, but failed to breach their cores. Hammers shattered tools before stone yielded. When sections were removed, the ash beneath compacted further, growing denser, resisting intrusion. The buildings seemed to respond to violence by tightening, as though pressure only strengthened what lay within. Those assigned to demolition fell ill more often than others. Some died suddenly, without visible signs of plague. Others complained of crushing fatigue, of breath shortening inexplicably, of dreams filled with enclosed spaces and collapsing walls. It was as if the houses resented being unmade, as if they reached outward to reclaim what had once been given. The realization settled slowly and horribly. The architect had not built shelters. He had built containers. The city itself had become a processing ground, its dead converted into architecture designed to outlast generations. The houses were not monuments to survival, but to endurance without mercy. In this light, the architect's disappearance no longer seemed mysterious. There was nowhere for him to go. His work did not require continuation. It required completion. Each vessel needed a final measure, a last binding force to seal what lay within. The city had provided countless bodies, but something more deliberate had been required to finish the design. By the time officials understood this, it was too late. The houses stood complete, their hunger sated, their walls quiet. Paris would rebuild around them, generations forgetting what lay beneath the stone, admiring their resilience without knowing its cost. The plague would fade into memory, but the buildings would remain, silent and patient, holding the weight of every ending they had been built to absorb. The final ledger entry concerning the architect surfaced years after the plague loosened its grip, buried among municipal records no one wished to revisit. It described a discovery made beneath the largest house he had ever built, a structure that dominated its quarter with unnatural composure. When authorities finally authorized a full excavation, driven less by courage than by the need to close the wound left in the city's memory, they expected more ash, more bone, perhaps a deeper concentration of the same blasphemous mortar. What they found instead ended all remaining speculation. Beneath the foundation lay a sealed chamber, perfectly integrated into the load-bearing structure. It had not been added after the fact. The house had been raised around it, stone by stone, its weight calculated to press inward rather than downward. Opening the chamber required days of labor, tools breaking and hands bleeding as the masonry resisted intrusion with stubborn resolve. When the final barrier gave way, the air that escaped was warm and dry, carrying that familiar blend of lime, iron, and sweetness that no one could ever again mistake for anything else. Inside lay the architect. His body had been fused into the foundation itself, not laid to rest but embedded with precision. His spine was bent unnaturally, curved to match the arc of the wall that cradled it. Limbs were folded inward, compressed until bone and joint surrendered to geometry. His skull was tilted back, jaw forced open and packed solid with mortar, sealing his mouth as thoroughly as any stone. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of haste. The posture was deliberate, ritualistic, a final act of alignment between flesh and structure. The mortar surrounding him was denser than anywhere else in the building, its composition refined, its texture smoother, warmer. Analysis revealed what instinct already screamed. The mixture contained not only ash and bone from countless others, but from the architect himself. He had prepared his own body as material, reducing parts of himself before entombing the rest. He had become the last ingredient, the final binding force that sealed the vessel completely. This revelation reframed everything that had come before. The houses had not merely consumed death. They had been waiting for something specific to complete them. The architect's presence at burial pits, his obsessive solitude, his refusal of apprentices, all pointed to a design that allowed no witnesses at its end. His disappearance had not been an escape. It had been a culmination. Officials sealed the chamber once more, not out of reverence, but because removing him threatened the stability of the entire structure. The building did not tolerate absence. Its walls shifted minutely when pressure was relieved, as though something inside resisted being unmade. The architect remained where he had placed himself, spine curved, mouth filled, holding the weight of everything above. In the years that followed, Paris rebuilt itself layer by layer. Streets were renamed. Districts were reshaped. The plague receded into chronicles and sermons, its horror softened by distance and repetition. The houses endured. Fire swept through the city more than once, devouring timber and roof, yet these structures blackened without collapsing. Revolutions shook the ground, cannon fire rattled stone, and still they stood. Renovations altered their interiors, disguising their origins beneath plaster and ornament, but their walls never failed. They came to be admired quietly, spoken of as marvels of medieval craftsmanship. Scholars praised their resilience. Engineers puzzled over their longevity. No one spoke openly of what lay beneath. Records were misplaced. Ledgers vanished. Knowledge became rumor. then superstition, then nothing at all. The truth retreated into the stone, where it had always belonged. Yet the buildings did not forget. Those who lived in them across the centuries reported the same sensations, though they used different words. A heaviness in the air, unsettling dreams, the feeling of being enclosed by something attentive. Some claimed the houses settled at night, not with the groans of age, but with slow, measured sighs that rippled faintly through walls. In winter, windows fogged from the inside, even when rooms were empty. In summer, the interiors remained cool, as though heat were drawn elsewhere and held. Children raised within those walls developed an aversion to silence. Animals refused to sleep near them. Renovation workers occasionally uncovered pockets of warmth behind walls, places where tools vibrated subtly in the hand. When asked, they laughed it off, unwilling to name the unease that lingered long after the work was done. Time wore down memory, but not structure. The houses persisted through regimes and restorations, through neglect and admiration alike. They required less maintenance than any other buildings of their age, as if sustained by something deeper than craft. The city learned to accept them as constants, fixed points in an ever-shifting landscape. Even now, when Paris sleeps and traffic fades into distant murmurs, those buildings are said to breathe. The sound is not loud, not dramatic, but steady, patient. A slow intake, a controlled release. They are not tired. They are satisfied. They have done what they were built to do and continue to do it still. They remember every death they were fed. They hold them compressed into mortar and bone, into warmth and silence. They endure not despite the plague, but because of it. The architect remains where he placed himself, curved into stone, listening through walls that no longer need his guidance. The city rests atop these vessels, unaware or unwilling to know. And beneath the admiration for resilience, beneath the praise for endurance, something ancient and deliberate continues its quiet work. Not protecting the living, not mourning the dead, simply holding, patiently and forever, everything it was built to survive.